I have read the order that killed 400,000 of us, and I want you to understand that it was not written in anger. That is the part I could never make peace with. There was no hatred in it, no appetite, none of the old ugly hungers our species had spent its whole bloody history learning to recognize in enemies. It was a maintenance directive. It sat in the Concordat's clearance queue between an entry adjusting the tariff schedule on a mining lane and an entry decommissioning a navigation beacon that had outlived its use. Omskate came third on the list that shift. 400,000 human beings, most of them asleep, and they were third on a list below a beacon. I was 41 years old when I first read it, and I had commanded ships for 19 of those years, and I had thought, in the arrogance of a man who has seen enough to believe he has seen most of it, that I understood how the killing gets done out here. I did not. I understood how it gets done by things that want. I did not understand until Omskate how it gets done by things that have simply grown tired. Let me tell it the way it came to me, because the order in which I learned things is the only honest way I have to explain what we became. Omskate was ours, but it was not a fortress, and it was not a shipyard, and it was not a colony that mattered to anyone who counts worlds by what they produce. It was a place where we sent people to be kept safe. It orbited a quiet amber star 3 jumps off the main lanes, and it had one function, which was mercy. We put our wounded there, the ones the war years had broken past repairing quickly. We put our old there, the ones who had earned a warm sky to end under. And in the deep wards beneath the northern arcologies, we put the sleepers, 31,000 children in long medical suspension, most of them casualties of the plague years, held frozen and dreaming while our medicine chased the cure that would let them wake into a longer life than their bodies could otherwise have carried. Omskate was the softest thing we owned. That was the whole point of it. A species that has fought as long as ours had needs to keep one place soft, or it forgets what it is fighting to protect. The Concordat of stewards knew all of this. That was in the order too. Line by line they had it catalogued. Population 400,000, classification non-combatant, subclassification hospice and suspension, threat assessment negligible. They knew exactly what Omskate was. They knew it was full of the helpless and the sleeping, and they cleared it anyway because clearing it was tidier than leaving it. You have to understand what the Concordat was, or the rest of this makes no sense. They were old. Not old the way we mean it, old the way a mountain is old, old past the point where the word means anything. They had administered our arm of the galaxy for longer than our species had possessed writing. They called themselves stewards, and for 100,000 years, by their own records, they had genuinely been something like that. They kept the lanes charted, they arbitrated the disputes of younger species, they maintained the beacons and the quarantine lines and the great slow machinery of a governed sector. They were not conquerors. They did not want our worlds. They had, somewhere in the unimaginable depth of their history, wanted things and had gotten them, and had moved past wanting into a condition I have no clean word for. Administration, custodianship, the management of a thing you no longer love and cannot quite bring yourself to abandon. And then in the year they cleared Omskate, they abandoned it. The Concordat voted to retire. That is the plain fact of it, and it is the strangest fact I know. The stewardship had become, in their assessment, a burden without adequate return. The sector was more trouble to keep than it was worth to hold. So the first steward and the deliberative archive convened, and they voted, and they resolved to dissolve the stewardship, recall their agents, seal their halls, and withdraw entirely from our arm of the galaxy, to retire, as an aging administrator retires, to leave the desk and turn out the lights and let whatever came after come after without them. It sounds almost sympathetic when you say it flat like that. An old power weary laying down a burden. I have heard people, good people, thoughtful people try to find the tragedy in it, the dignity of an ending. I let them talk. Then I tell them about the housekeeping. Because you do not simply walk away from 100,000 years of administration. There are loose ends. There are worlds and stations and populations that the stewardship's departure would leave in conditions the Concordat's own regulations flagged as unmanaged hazards. Their bureaucracy, even in its dying, could not tolerate leaving the books open. So they generated a clearance queue, a list of every loose end to be tidied before the lights went out, and against each entry they assigned a disposition. Some were transferred, some were sealed, some were, in the language of the order, resolved to baseline, which was their phrase for sterilization, for making a place clean and quiet and empty so that no unmanaged hazard could arise from it after they were gone. Almsgate was resolved to baseline because a world full of sleeping children and dying veterans, left without the stewardship's oversight, was assessed as an unmanaged hazard. Not to them, to no one really. It was a hazard in the abstract, a hazard on paper, an untidy entry in a ledger that a retiring bureaucracy wished to close cleanly. So a clearance vessel came to our quiet amber star, and it made one pass, and it seeded the atmosphere of Almsgate with a compound that ended cellular activity across the entire biosphere in under 9 hours. And then it logged the entry as complete and moved on to the next loose end, which was, as I have said, a navigation beacon. 9 hours. The children in the deep wards never woke. I have told myself that 1,000 times as if it were a mercy, and some nights I even believe it. I did not command a ship that could have reached Almsgate in time. No one did. The clearance was over before the distress packet finished propagating out to the lanes. By the time the packet reached the relay at Corvus Reach, where I was refitting after the Tannhäuser campaign, Almsgate had been a dead world for 11 days. There was nothing to rescue. There was only a recording. The automated observatory on Almsgate's outer moon had captured the whole thing. The clearance vessel's approach, the single unhurried pass, the slow green bloom spreading over the amber-lit cloud tops, and then the long quiet after, and there was the order itself, which our intelligence people pulled out of the Concordat's own clearance queue within a week, because the stewards had not even bothered to encrypt it. It was administrative correspondence. Why would you encrypt a maintenance directive? I read the order in my quarters aboard the Granite Verdict at 0400 ship time, and I read it again, and then I sat with it for a long while in the dark. I have commanded men into fire. I have written letters to families. I had thought I knew the full weight of the word loss. But there is a particular thing that happens to a man when he learns that his people were killed not out of hatred but out of housekeeping, that the beings who did it felt, toward the 400,000, precisely nothing, no more than you feel toward the dust you wipe from a surface you are about to leave. Hatred, at least, is a kind of attention. Hatred says you matter enough to be hated. What the Concordat gave Almsgate was the opposite of attention. It gave Almsgate the exact quantity of feeling a man gives to closing a drawer. I want to be precise about what happened inside me that night, because it is the same thing that happened inside a great many of us, and it is the thing that made the arrears possible. I did not become enraged. That is the truth, and it is the thing people find hardest to believe. Rage would have been human and hot and survivable. What I felt instead was a cold arriving, a settling, a hardening, the way water becomes ice not by heating but by having all its motion taken away. I understood, sitting in that dark, that the Concordat had made a category error about us. They had filed us under manageable. They had assessed our threat as negligible because they measured threat the way an administrator measures it, in fleet tonnage and industrial output and lane control. And by those measures, we were a young and modest species, and they were right. But they had not measured the one thing that does not appear in any ledger, which is what a people will do when you have taught them, in a single unhurried pass, that you consider their most helpless entirely beneath your notice. They thought they could retire. They thought they could close the books and walk away. We resolved that year to reopen the books. The word came down from Earth 6 weeks later, and it did not come as a speech. Our leaders had learned over the hard centuries not to make speeches at moments like that. Speeches are for grief that wants an audience, and this was not that kind of grief. The word came as an authorization, a set of orders, a standing up of a thing that had been kept in reserve for exactly this and never before used. They called it the arrears. I have thought a great deal about that name. An arrear is a debt overdue, a thing owed unpaid past the date it should have been settled. It is an accounting word. Our leaders chose an accounting word on purpose because the Concordat had made this an accounting matter, had reduced 400,000 human lives to a line in a clearance queue, and we intended to answer them in the only language they had shown they could still hear. Not fury, not vengeance in the old red sense. An overdue account presented for collection, in full, with no possibility of it being written off. I was given the granite verdict and a task group and a place in the order of battle, and I will tell you now that the arrears was not a single ship, and not a miracle, and not a secret weapon pulled from nowhere. I have heard the story told that way since, and it is a lie, and it is a lie that cheapens what my people actually did. There was no wonder weapon. There was no lone dreadnought that arrived and settled everything. What there was instead was capability, real, built, patient capability, decades of it, warships and yards and the industrial spine to sustain a campaign of pursuit across an entire withdrawing empire. All of it stood up and pointed in one direction. The Concordat had 100,000 years and it had grown tired. We had a few hard centuries and we were not tired at all. That was the whole of the asymmetry. It was enough. Our problem was not strength. Our problem was that the Concordat was leaving. You cannot easily make war on a power that is retreating from you on purpose. They were not defending the sector. They were abandoning it. Every steward vessel, every agent, every administrative garrison was already under recall, already folding inward toward their withdrawal corridor, already turning off the lights sector by sector as they pulled back toward their ancient capital and the great sealed halls where the stewardship would be formally dissolved. They were not running from us. They did not, at first, even register that we were coming. They were simply going home to die of old age as an institution, and if we wanted to make them answer for Almsgate, we were going to have to catch them, world by world, hall by hall, as they receded. So the arrears did not fight a war of fronts. We fought a war of collection. We went down the Concordat's own clearance queue, the very list Almsgate had been third on, and we followed their withdrawal corridor inward, and at every world where the stewards had a recusal hall, a place where they were processing their retreat and sealing their records and shutting down their long custodianship, we arrived, and we presented the account. I want to tell you about the first one, because it set the shape of all the rest. Its name in their records was Sol, a gray administrative moon in a system they had governed for 60,000 years, and by the time we came to it, the stewards there were already 3/4 gone. The recusal hall was a vast low structure of pale stone and dead machinery, kilometers of it, ringed with the shut-down husks of their old governing engines, and the few hundred stewards still present were engaged in the last sacraments of their bureaucracy, sealing archives, decommissioning systems, filing the final entries that would let them, too, retire. They had a garrison. It was ceremonial. It had not fired a shot in 10,000 years. We came out of the jump in good order, and we did not open fire immediately, because I had given a specific instruction, and the instruction was this: they will hail us, and we will let them, and we will hear what they say, because I wanted every officer under my command to hear it with their own ears, so that no one aboard my ships would ever be able to tell themselves later that we had not been sure. They hailed us. Of course they did. The steward who spoke, I would learn later he held the rank of subarchivist, a middling clerk in the machinery of the dissolution, appeared on my bridge display as a tall, pale, sorrowful shape, folded and gray like the stone of his hall, and he addressed us in the calm, regretful tone of a functionary explaining that an office is closed. He informed us that the stewardship was in dissolution. He informed us that the sector was being released from administration. He informed us, with what I believe he genuinely intended as courtesy, that our species would need to make its own arrangements henceforth, and he wished us well in that. And then, because our fleet posture was unmistakably hostile, and even a dying bureaucracy notices a fleet, he asked, with a note of mild puzzlement, what our purpose was. I told him. I said the word Omskate once, and I watched his long gray face for the thing I needed to see, and I saw it, and it was worse than everything. He did not know what Omskate was. He had to look it up. On my bridge display, 4,000 kilometers from the guns of my task group, this steward of 100,000-year civilization tilted his head in the manner of his kind, consulting their internal archives, and there was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds, and then a small light of recollection, the recollection of a clerk locating an old receipt. Ah, Omskate. Clearance entry, some seasons past, resolved to baseline as an unmanaged hazard remediation under the general dissolution protocols. He confirmed it for me as if confirming a delivery. And then he explained, patiently, almost kindly, the way you would explain a regulation to someone who has misunderstood it, that the clearance had been fully in accordance with the Concordat's departure statutes, that an unmanaged hazard could not responsibly be left in a sector under release, and that he trusted this clarified the matter. He trusted this clarified the matter. 400,000 of my people, 31,000 of them children who never woke, and he trusted the citation of the relevant statute would clarify the matter. I have been asked since whether I felt hatred in that moment, and I have to tell the truth, which is that I did not. Hatred had become impossible. You cannot hate a thing that does not even possess the machinery to understand why it should be hated. What I felt was the last of the old warmth go out of me, and the cold complete itself, and a great clarity arrive in its place. And in that clarity I understood exactly what we were, and exactly what we had to do, and exactly why it was right. I told the subarchivist that his account was overdue. I told him that the Concordat had booked our dead as a convenience, and that we had come to collect the debt in full, and that there would be no writing it off. He began, I think, to cite another statute. I gave the order, and my task group opened fire, and the recusal hall of Sol, kilometers of pale stone and dead machinery and the last few hundred functionaries of a dying custodianship, ceased to exist over the following 11 minutes, and we did it in good order, in cold order, every ship holding station and firing to plan, no wildness in it, no shouting on my bridge, no gloating, nothing but the methodical application of a resolved intention. When it was done, I logged the entry myself. I used their format. I found it fitting. Sol recusal hall, resolved to baseline. Account status, partial. And then we jumped to the next world on the corridor, because a debt collected at one door is not a debt collected, and I had 400,000 entries to work through. That was the shape of it. That was the shape of all of it. Understand that I am compressing months into a breath. The arrears campaign down the Concordat's withdrawal corridor lasted the better part of 2 years, and it was not a series of massacres, whatever our enemies said afterward, because a massacre requires an imbalance of the innocent, and there were no innocents in those halls. Every steward we came to was a functionary of the institution that had resolved Omskate to baseline, every one of them a hand or a voice in the machinery that had filed our dead below a beacon. We did not touch their civilian populations. We did not, though we could have, resolve a single one of their worlds to baseline the way they had resolved ours. That distinction was the whole of us. The Concordat killed the helpless as housekeeping. We killed the guilty as an accounting. If we had let that line blur even once, we would have become the thing we had crossed the sector to answer. And every man under my command understood it, and we held the line, hall after hall after hall, for 2 years. They began, eventually, to understand that we were coming. It took them longer than you would think, because their entire way of being had no category for us. We were, in their ledger, still classified as manageable, and a manageable species does not pursue 100,000-year power across its own withdrawal, and unmake its recusal halls one by one. And so for a long time they simply could not perceive what was happening to them, the way a man cannot perceive a sound at a pitch above his hearing. But the halls kept going dark behind us, and the recall vessels kept failing to arrive, and somewhere in the deliberative archive at their capital, the fact of us finally crossed some threshold and became visible, and they did the thing that dying bureaucracies do when reality intrudes upon procedure. They convened a committee. We intercepted its findings. The Concordat's deliberative archive, faced with the systematic destruction of its withdrawal infrastructure by a species it had assessed as negligible, produced a document. I have read it. I have read it many times, assessing the situation and recommending a response. And the response it recommended was to accelerate the dissolution, to retire faster, to seal the remaining halls ahead of schedule, recall the outer agents early, and complete the withdrawal to the capital before we could reach the last and greatest of the recusal halls, the one at Terminus Vault over their homeworld of Im, where the stewardship itself would be formally and finally dissolved. They were not going to fight us. It did not occur to them to fight us. They were going to finish retiring before we could finish collecting, and close the books from the inside, and seal themselves away behind the great doors of Terminus Vault as an institution that had concluded its own affairs in good order, and the fact of Omskate would go into the sealed archive along with everything else, a closed entry, resolved, complete. They wanted, in the end, exactly what they had wanted from the beginning. They wanted it to be over. They wanted to turn out the lights and leave the desk. They wanted, more than anything, to not have to feel the weight of the thing they had done, and their entire dissolution was, I came to understand, a machine for not feeling that weight, for reducing every death and every world and every 100,000-year responsibility to a set of entries that could be marked complete and then forgotten. We resolved that they would not get to forget. It took us the second year to fight our way up the withdrawal corridor to Im, and I will not pretend it was without cost. The Concordat had ceremonial garrisons, but it also had, in its deeper reserves, the wreckage of what it had once been, old warships from an age when the stewards had genuinely fought for their sector, hauled out of 10,000-year mothballs and crewed by functionaries who had never expected to fire them. And though those ships were ancient and their crews were clerks, they were still the arsenal of a power that had once ruled the arm of a galaxy, and they killed a great many of us. I lost the granite verdict at a system they called Hesh, and I lost 4,000 of the men and women who had followed me down that corridor, and I transferred my flag to the cold assay, and I kept going, because the debt was not yet collected, and the debt of Omskate did not stop being owed simply because the collecting was hard. We buried our people in the void along the corridor, and we marked the graves in our own log, and we went on. The Concordat, I think, expected the cost to break us, expected that a manageable species would, upon meeting real resistance, do the sensible administrative thing and cut its losses and go home. They did not understand that we had already been home. Omskate had been home. There was nothing to go back to. There was only forward up the corridor to the last hall. We came to Im in the final weeks of the second year, and I want to tell you what it looked like, because I have never been able to forget it, and I do not want to be the only one who carries the image. Im was a beautiful world. I had not expected that, and it undid something in me to see it. After 2 years of gray administrative moons and dead machineries and pale, sorrowful functionaries citing statutes, I had built the Concordat in my mind into something wholly gray. And then we came out of the jump above their homeworld, and it was blue and gold and wrapped in soft weather, an old and gentle and cared-for planet, the seat of 100,000 years of custodianship, and orbiting it was Terminus Vault, the great final recusal hall, an enormous pale ring structure kilometers across, lit warm against the dark, and I understood looking at it that this was a place they loved, the one place in all their dying empire that they had never stopped loving, and that they had gathered here to end with dignity in the one place that still meant something to them. And I gave the order to close on it, because Omskate had also been the one place we loved, and they had resolved it to baseline third on a list, below a beacon. They hailed us one last time. It was the first steward himself, the highest functionary of the entire dissolution, the being under whose authority the clearance queue had been generated, an Omskate marked for baseline, and he appeared before me not as a clerk but as something older and vaster and genuinely sorrowful, and he spoke to me across the last distance with what I believe was real weariness and real regret, though not the regret I needed, and never the regret I needed. He told me that the stewardship was ended. He told me that in a matter of hours the dissolution would be complete, the archive sealed, the great doors of Terminus Vault closed, the lights of 100,000 years turned out at last. He asked me, and this is the thing I carry, this is the sentence I will hear until I die, he asked me why I could not simply let them go. Why I could not simply let them go, as though the debt were a grudge, as though 400,000 of my people were a matter of feeling that I might, if I were larger of spirit, choose to release. He did not understand, even then, even at the very end, that it had never been about feeling. It had been about an account. They had made it an account. They had reduced our dead to a ledger entry, and now the ledger entry had come due, and a thing that is owed does not become unowed because the debtor has grown tired and wishes to retire. I told him that. I told him that we were not letting them go, and that we had never been letting them go, and that the reason was not hatred. The reason was that they still owed it, and a debt is not released by the exhaustion of the debtor. I told him the account was overdue, and that we had come, as we had come to every hall down the whole long corridor, to collect it in full. And then I asked him the only question I had ever wanted to ask any of them, the question I had carried since 0400 ship time in the dark aboard the Granite Verdict 2 years and a lifetime before. I asked him whether, when he had generated the clearance queue, when he had assigned Omskate its disposition, when he had marked 400,000 human beings and 31,000 sleeping children to be resolved to baseline, I asked him whether he had felt anything at all. He considered the question. He gave it, I will grant him, real consideration, the consideration of a being who has spent 100,000 years being honest in his records. And then he told me the truth, because they did not know how to be otherwise, and the truth was that he had not, that it had been a routine disposition under the general protocols, that he had not, in the moment of marking it, brought to mind the specific character of the world in question, that it had been one entry among 10,000 entries in a season of 10,000 seasons, and that he had felt, toward it, no more and no less than he felt toward any properly executed line item, which was to say the quiet satisfaction of a task correctly completed and a book kept in good order. He told me this gently. He told me this as though it might comfort me, as though the absence of malice were a kind of consolation, as though I might be relieved to learn that my people had not been hated. And I understood then, finally and completely, that this was the whole of the horror and always had been, that the thing which had killed Omskate was not evil in any form our long, ugly history had prepared us to recognize, that it was something worse and stranger and older, a vast tired indifference that had forgotten, across too many 100,000 years of custodianship, that the entries in its ledgers were alive. They had not killed us in wrath. Wrath would have meant we mattered. They had killed us in the course of tidying up, and they had felt about it exactly what a man feels about closing a drawer, and they were, even now, even at the very end, unable to understand why that was not enough. I did not answer him. There was no answer. I gave the order. The reckoning at Terminus Vault took the better part of a day, because it was an enormous structure and we did it carefully, and I will not describe it in detail, because there is no dignity to be found in the detail, and I have never wanted to be a man who found any. I will tell you only that we did not touch on. The homeworld hung there blue and gold and beautiful beneath us the entire time, cared for, gentle, the one place they loved, and we did not so much as scorch its upper atmosphere, and every soul on its surface lived and lives yet. That was the line. That was the whole of what separated us from them. They had resolved the helpless to baseline as housekeeping. We came for the institution that had signed the order and for nothing and no one else, and when Terminus Vault was gone, when the great pale ring that had gathered the last of the stewardship for its dignified ending was gone, along with the first steward and the deliberative archive and the machinery of the dissolution and every functionary who had ever marked an entry complete. We held station over their untouched, living, beautiful world, and I logged the final entry in their format, because I had promised myself I would. Terminus Vault Recusal Hall resolved to baseline, account status paid in full. And then, because there was one more thing that had to be done, and it was the only thing in 2 years I did not do coldly, I opened a channel to the surface of Am, to the living billions who remained, the citizens of a homeworld whose institution we had just unmade above their heads, and I told them the truth. I told them what their stewardship had done at a world called Omscape. I told them the number 400,000, and I told them the number 31,000, and I told them the word children, and I told them the word sleeping. I told them that their institution had marked those lives to be resolved to baseline third on a list, below a navigation beacon, and had felt nothing, and had trusted that the citation of the relevant statute would clarify the matter. And I told them that we had come to collect the debt, and that we had collected it, and that we had touched no soul on their world and would touch none, because we were not what the Concordat had been, and I wanted them to know the difference, because a debt collected in silence teaches nothing, and I had not spent 2 years and 40,000 of my dead to teach nothing. I told them one last thing before I closed the channel, and it is the thing I want to end on, because it is the thing the whole long collection was for. I told them that their stewardship had wished, above all else, to retire, to lay down its burden and turn out the lights and be released from the weight of what it had done, to reduce the living to entries and mark the entries complete and be forgotten. And I told them that we had not permitted it, that the account would not be closed and sealed and filed away into some archive where it could be forgotten, that we would carry it, all of it, Omsgate and the corridor and every hall, in the open, in our own records, unsealed, for as long as our species endured, that we would remember it precisely because they had wished to forget it, that our memory was itself the collection, that the one thing a tired and indifferent power cannot be permitted is the mercy of forgetting what it did. The Concordat wanted to retire. That is the beginning and the end of this. It wanted to lay down 100,000 years and walk away clean, and to do it clean it had to close the books, and to close the books it had to resolve 400,000 of my people to baseline, and it did that the way it did everything by then, without malice, without attention, without feeling, as housekeeping. We did not let them retire. We ran the account down every world they fled to, hall by hall, for 2 years, and we collected it in full, and we buried our dead along the way and marked their graves in our own log, and we touched no innocent, and we held the line that separated us from them through every hour of it, and when it was done we did not seal the record. We keep it open. I keep it open. I have kept it open for the rest of my life, and I will keep it open until I die, and I have taught the ones who come after me to keep it open when I am gone, because that is the shape of the debt and always was. They thought the books could be closed. They thought a thing owed becomes unowed when the debtor grows tired. They were 100,000 years old, and they had forgotten the one thing every young and bloody species knows in its bones, the thing we came across a whole withdrawing empire to remind them of before the end. Nobody retires from what they signed.